The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
Liberty. Liberty.
Liberty.
Liberty.
Liberty. Liberty.
Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And welcome into Liberty Nation on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Corombos, news director at Radio America and co-host of the Three Martini Lunch podcast, filling in for Tim Donner again this week. Tim will be back next week. Coming up in this edition, Nikki Haley's legacy. We'll speak with former Pentagon official Frank Gaffney about why Nikki Haley was so effective at the United Nations and what President Trump should be looking for in her successor. We'll also take a look at the liberal reactions to the confirmation of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, ranging from the tactical to the constitutionally laughable. LibertyNation.com's own Scott Cosenza will join us for that. This past week, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says the United States and the rest of the world have only 12 years to get our act together and take drastic action to curb carbon emissions and save the planet. Other people think that's just a bit hyperbolic. One of them is Dr. Roy Spencer, one of the leading climate experts in this country. He'll be joining us in just a few minutes. But up first, we take a look at the fate of one of the most liberty-minded members of Congress as he faces a very tough re-election fight. My guest at this time is Virginia Republican Congressman Dave Brat. He represents the Old Dominion's 7th Congressional District, and he is in a tough re-election battle against Democrat Abigail Spanberger. It's one of a number of congressional districts in Virginia held by a Republican, but severely targeted by the Democrats. And Congressman, thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, you bet. Thank you, Greg.
Well, we've got about 4 weeks left now until this midterm election, and the one poll I've seen from the New York Times has you up 4, but the margin of error is right around that same spot right now. So how do you see the race?
Yeah, I think after the Kavanaugh hearings, it's 4 plus a big upward bump. And I think the American people are finally zooming in, and so they're noticing that my opponent doesn't have a platform. She's not running on any issues whatsoever. So it really is kind of matching and mirroring the national piece. We have policy on health care. We win on open borders, liberal immigration policy. My opponents for sanctuary cities, we win. And my opponent said the tax cuts were dangerous. And so she's Nancy Pelosi on policy. And the rest is just resistance from the left. And I think the American people want to see some results up there. And so we got tax cuts. My district is booming. The jobs are doing great. There's more job openings than people searching. And everybody's seeing it, right? The unemployment rate are at all-time lows for African Americans and women, decades lows for Asians, young kids, Hispanics. And so we got a good news, results-driven message, and we're happy to take that to the voters.
Abigail Spanberger says that you have been an opponent of making sure people with pre-existing conditions have coverage. I know you fought back against that vigorously. What's the story there?
Yeah, well, I don't understand why it's a story, but the news, the mainstream media doesn't do news anymore. I mean, if everybody missed the memo, that was the biggest debate of the year, and we had the health care vote, and we all voted for pre-existing conditions. And so that shows you how the Democrats are hurting, right? We're ahead, they're losing, so they have to spread total pants-on-fire falsehoods. And everybody knows that was a key feature of our Republican health care plan. And I held it up at my town hall with a legislative text with pre-existing conditions in, and Abigail Spanberger was in the front row and saw it a long time ago. So she knows it. She's intentionally spreading that. So I'm glad you brought the issue up. Democrats, that's what they do in the last month of a campaign. When they're losing, they say their Republicans are going to take away Social Security and Medicare when we promised and are on the record pledging to protect those programs. We're good on pre-existing conditions. And then they really get personal. You know, they did the personal destruction with Kavanaugh, et cetera. And so I don't think the voters like that. They want to see a more civil debate on policy.
Congressman, let's talk about your opponent a little bit, Abigail Spanberger. She has a background in the CIA, and also for a time before her tenure at the CIA, she was connected to an institution that has raised more than a few eyebrows. The media coverage of your campaign raising this issue has not been kind, but what do you want the voters in your district to know about her affiliations?
Well, she has not told the voters anything about her record or her resume. And so I think what you might be referring to is her work at the Saudi-funded terror high school. And she is telling people she worked at an embassy high school and taught Shakespeare, et cetera. But there's a government report out put out by the Democrats, Schumer and Israel, to shut down the school because it was anti-Semitic, anti-Christian, anti-women, and full of hate, that you can kill people from other faiths, et cetera, if they disagree with you. And so that's what has come into question. The Washington Post did an essay on that school before she got the job. She went to work for the CIA after that, after teaching there. But the question is, if she went to the New York Times and said, I'm proud of teaching at that school. And that school produced terrorists and someone that wanted to kill a president, et cetera. And there's a U.S. government report saying that is not an embassy school. And so I think that's what you're talking about with that story. Mm-hmm. And no one in the news media has yet reported on it, on the facts of the story. And they've kind of hidden behind the process question, but they don't get to the meat and potatoes. And the easiest way to show the contrast is, can you imagine if a Republican taught at a school that was anti-Semitic, anti-Christian, anti-women, and a Saudi Wahhabi fundamentalist school? I mean, it'd be the front page of the New York Times for weeks.
I know we've only got about 90 seconds left, Congressman. Just this week, the current House Majority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, unveiling border security, build the wall legislation. I know immigration was a key issue in you initially getting elected to Congress. I know it's still an issue you're passionate about. So 2 quick questions in our last minute here. What do you think of the bill, and why is he rolling it out now instead of sometime in the past 2 years?
Well, yeah, I'm all in favor of it, and I hope it's a strong bill. I've been for the Goodlatte bill, which includes that plus other features, and so it's just all good news. We've had, some budgets that the president's not happy with. I'm not happy with the $1 trillion deficits, and we did not get wall funding. So I think that's why it's in now. It'll come up after the election, before January, and so I hope we keep our leverage there, because it's 70 or 80% issue for the people, right? No one wants the cheap labor piece. We have 300 million lethal doses of fentanyl come across the border last year through our open borders, right? And the Democrats, my opponents, Spanberger's for sanctuary cities, Nancy Pelosi's for San Francisco sanctuary cities, that actually provide a sanctuary for the drug dealers who commit crimes. And I don't know if the American people fully understand that, but that's what's at stake. And so it's long overdue. I'm happy they're bringing it up.
Congressman, we know you've got to run. Thank you, sir, very much for your time today.
Thank you, Greg. Anytime. Thank you.
You bet, sir. Virginia Republican Congressman Dave Brat represents his state's 7th Congressional District, up for re-election against Democrat Abigail Spanberger on November 6th. I'm Greg Corombos, filling in for Tim Donner this week on Liberty Nation. When we come back, we'll be talking with Dr. Royce Spencer from the University of Alabama, Huntsville, who will explain why we don't need to be all that concerned about the UN's latest warning that we're all doomed. We'll be right back.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
I'm Greg Corombos, filling in for Tim Donner this week. My guest at this time is Dr. Roy Spencer, Principal Research Scientist at the University of Alabama, Huntsville. He is also the author of ebooks such as Inevitable Disaster, Why Hurricanes Can't Be Blamed on Global Warming, and Global Warming Skepticism for Busy People. We've asked him to comment on the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issuing a dire warning that climate change may take us past the tipping point by 2030 unless leaders around the globe take sweeping action to mitigate the warming of the planet. And Dr. Spencer, thanks so much for being with us.
And thanks for having me.
What was your initial response to seeing this report that we've essentially got 12 years to stave off climatological changes that we might never recover from?
Well, my initial reaction is that the less people listen to the IPCC, it seems like the louder they have to scream, because this report is even more alarmist than previous reports, making it sound like, that it's really imperative to keep future warming below 2 degrees, and we got to get it down to 1.5 degrees. And there's all different ways we could look at this, but basically the science doesn't support the idea that we are even going to warm by that much, let alone that we could prevent that warming from occurring. I think we are going to reach 1.5 degrees, but to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, the amount they're talking about, it's basically physically impossible. We cannot replace fossil fuels at the level that's required to achieve what they are trying to achieve.
You touched on so many important points there, so let me try to follow up on them one at a time. First of all, you talked about the projections of the IPCC. What's been their track record over the past 25 to 30 years?
Well, basically, they use these climate models, that run on computers. And they go basically according to the average of all the climate models. That's the basis for their projections of how much it's going to warm in the future and how much it should have warmed in the past. Basically, those projections are off by almost a factor of 2. In other words, those models are warming up the Earth twice as fast as has been observed since, let's say, the 1950s. Okay, and when I say the Earth warming, the climate system warming, I'm talking about the combination of the deep ocean and the atmosphere, because you have to look at the whole system together. And if you put all of that together, the models are warming things too fast. A second point is they assume all of the warming is due to humans, when in fact, I would say up to 50% of it could be natural warming, because we had warming in the first half of the 20th century. And then we've seen warming in the second half of the 20th century. Well, the warming, 100 years ago couldn't have been our fault. So how do they know that it's entirely our fault now? Well, they don't know. So when you put all of these things together, I think the amount of warming we will see in the future is less than what they're projecting, and I'm guessing by about 50%. So in other words, we only have half the problem that they're talking about. And then beyond that, we can talk about all of their exaggerations about worsening weather, droughts, floods, all of that. If you look at the data, that stuff has not happened yet.
So what is responsible for whatever warming there is? You're suggesting it's not nearly as significant as they say it is. Is it merely cyclical? Do you believe humans play any role in this? How should we view the fact that it has gone up at least a little?
I do believe that humans play a role. I believe that the CO2 we're adding to the atmosphere does cause some warming. I believe that the latest best evidence, there's some recent work that's been done in the last year that's been published, suggests that the amount of warming we should see from a doubling of carbon dioxide, which will occur late in the century, will be about 1.5 degrees. So, yes, I do believe that humans do have an influence, that some of the warming, probably more than half of it, in my mind, if I had to guess, I think more than half of the warming we've seen is due to humans, but it's not that much warming anyway. These reports, like this one that was just released by the IPCC, come out with gross exaggerations and attributions to humans, which just cannot be. You can't show that humans have caused increasing droughts, increasing floods, increasing hurricanes, because none of that stuff has happened. This stuff, we have statistics on all of this, and they are, I hate to say it, but I think they are just making things up. Just because something bad happened in, wildfires in Northern California, okay, that doesn't prove anything. Globally, wildfires are down substantially. Wildfires in the western U.S. are down substantially. Hurricanes. Basically, there's been no long-term change in global hurricane activity. So there's very little that they can point to in the way of changes that have occurred, let alone due to humans. Even if there were changes, we wouldn't be able to say how much was due to natural cycles in the climate system versus humans. So there's just so many things that are wrong with this report. It's basically fear-mongering.
Dig a little deeper, if you can, Dr. Spencer, into the 1.5 degrees Celsius that they see as the key benchmark here. You mentioned a moment ago that you believe that it's not nearly that significant. It's probably about half that. But is that a significant benchmark?
No, they're making it sound like there are tipping points. That we've got to keep it to 1.5 degrees, that 1.5 degrees will be so much better than 2 degrees. And there's no evidence I've seen that suggests that there's any kind of tipping point. Just that the warmer it gets, probably the worse it will be for, some aspects of the world, of the biosphere, or for humanity. It's just sort of a continuum. If it warmed by 10 degrees C, I would admit that's a bad thing. Okay, probably a very bad thing for some people. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about 1.5 degrees C, maybe 2 degrees C. Okay, these are things that people can cope with. The cost of preventing 0.5 degree C of warming, remember, they're trying to get the limit from 2 degrees down to 1.5 degrees, would require such a huge cutback in fossil fuel use that it would greatly exacerbate poverty around the world. Already, tens of thousands of people are dying from energy poverty during the winter, and that's going to get massively worse. Okay, if there's one thing we know that kills people in the world, it's poverty. And what the IPCC wants to do, and the United Nations wants to do, is tax carbon-based fuels, coal, natural gas, petroleum, at such a large extent that we will only have access to very expensive fuel sources, wind and solar, which are still quite a bit more expensive than carbon-based fuels. And since everything requires energy, everything we do, every single thing humans do requires energy, it's going to make all of humanity poorer, and poverty kills. Yes. And for instance, Bjorn Lomborg years ago brought together some of the world's best economists, some of which are Nobel laureates, who said, even if global warming ends up being bad, let's say in the next 50 to 100 years, he assumed the IPCC models were correct. And he said it still makes more sense to adapt for humanity because it would be so horrendously expensive that you're going to kill way more people trying to save them from global warming just by making them so poor.
Dr. Spencer, very interesting, very informative. Thank you, sir, very much for your time today.
You're welcome.
Dr. Roy Spencer, Principal Research Scientist at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, also the author of ebooks such as Inevitable Disaster, Why Hurricanes Can't Be Blamed on Global Warming, and Global Warming Skepticism for Busy People. Still to come in this edition, our weekly legal roundup with Scott Cosenza. But up next, Nikki Haley's legacy and what President Trump should want in the next UN ambassador. I'm Greg Corombos. We'll be right back on Liberty Nation.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Corombos, news director at the Radio America Network and co-host of the 3 Martini Lunch podcast, filling in for Tim this week. My guest at this time is Frank Gaffney. He's president of the Center for Security Policy and also served as an assistant secretary of defense in the Reagan administration. Earlier this week, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley announced she would step down from that position at the end of the year. President Trump says he wants to have her replacement nominated in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So, what is Nikki Haley's legacy at the UN, and what type of person should Trump be looking for to replace her? And Frank, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Thank you, Greg.
Well, let's start with Nikki Haley before we get to who ought to replace her. Here's what she said in the Oval Office earlier this week about what she sees as the legacy of the past 2 years.
Look at what has happened in 2 years with the United States on foreign policy. Now, the United States is respected. Countries may not like what we do, but they respect what we do. They know that if we say we're going to do something, we follow it through, and the president proved that, whether it was with the chemical weapons in Syria, whether it's with NATO, saying that other countries have to pay their share. I mean, whether it's the trade deals, which have been amazing. They get that the president means business, and they follow through with that.
Frank, what do you see as Nikki Haley's legacy?
I think she has been the face in that very public forum of the president's Make America Great strategy. She has been a very effective spokesperson for it. She has been a tireless defender of America against all attacks. She has been a catalyst for really tough love for the United Nations and its various corrupt and malfeasant entities. And I think, in short, she's very much in the mold of some of the truly great UN ambassadors from the United States. Jeane Kirkpatrick, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, John Bolton come to mind. And I would hope very much that the president will replace her with someone of a similar both capability as well as clarity in terms of their admiration and love, indeed, for our country and, vigor in being willing to defend her.
How significant is this position when it comes to U.S. foreign policy? Obviously, it matters a lot because they're the face of the United States at the United Nations, and what they have to say gets a lot of attention. But ultimately, it's the president and certainly the Secretary of State who generally have the most influence on policy. So how significant is the role?
It varies greatly from administration to administration and even from the ambassador within administrations. It's a function very much of both the temperament and quality of the individual who's in the job, as well as the kind of relationship they have to the president and, for that matter, to others in the senior reaches of the administration. In this case, I think there's no question that as a cabinet member, some are, some aren't, but in her case, Ambassador Haley was a cabinet member as well as a UN representative. She did have influence. I think, if in no other way, what she went out and said did have an impact on policy, as well as simply broadcasting the policies that were being crafted in Washington. I think she was, in some cases, stretching the envelope, as they say, and that did have an effect of both reinforcing the broad outlines of the president's policy and I think to some extent shaping it as well.
Frank, one of the names floated shortly after the Haley announcement to succeed her was former Deputy National Security Advisor Dina Powell. On Thursday, she took her name out of the running, but your comment that you gave at the time that her name was being mentioned, and you were critical of the idea of her replacing Nikki Haley, was not just about Powell. You've suggested that there's a right mindset to have at the UN and a wrong one. Explain what you mean by that and what the president should be looking for here.
Well, partly, Greg, of course, it's a question of the policy of the government. There's right and wrong policies. We saw, for example, during the Obama years, there was this certain citizen of the world mindset, and the United States was relegated to more or less just another nation, which is, of course, part of the artifice of the UN, the General Assembly most especially. You can have the tiniest of countries having an equal vote to the United States in the General Assembly. In the Security Council, of course, we have a larger role, a veto-wielding role, but we're on a par with France, for that matter, or Britain, and that's not, of course, entirely accurate. More to the point, I think that there is this question of if the policies of the administration are sound, and I think by and large that's true of the Trump administration, you don't want somebody as an ambassador representing our government, representing this administration, representing this president, who is at odds with the policies of the president. And that was certainly true of Dina Powell during the time she served under H.R. McMaster, the then National Security Advisor. I call them the insubordinate subordinates. And, you just don't want either the friction in the policymaking process, to the extent that the UN representative does play a role in it, and more to the point, the confusion that it creates among our international interlocutors in the United Nations itself and elsewhere around the world. And for that matter, you don't want us to be in a situation where the individual who is interfacing with them is actually expressing more sympathy for those others' positions than those of our own government. That can be extremely counterproductive. So I'm glad that Dina Powell has taken her name out of contention. That was really going to be a nightmare, I think. But I hope the president will be, in fact, looking for someone very much in the Nikki Haley mold. And if he does, I think he'll be well served. Any in particular you'd like to volunteer to him to consider? Well, there are some names that are kicking around, and some are probably not runners, but there are some people who certainly fit the profile that I think is needed here. One is the former Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, who, interestingly enough, has until recently been working for a non-governmental organization as sort of a representative to the United Nations. She's very familiar with what goes on there, and she is, needless to say, a forceful advocate for America in much the same mold as the president and Nikki Haley, John Bolton, and the like. There's some talk about Lindsey Graham, who of late in particular has been quite robust, being a possible exponent for the United States there. Another friend of mine who I think would be terrific, has been a dogged critic of the UN for a long time as a journalist. Her name is Claudia Rosette. She's long been with the Wall Street Journal and other publications, and few people know where the bodies are buried, literally, in the United Nations policy process like Claudia does. She may remember, was the one who uncovered the Saddam Hussein oil for food program and the scandals associated with that. So I think she'd be great, but I don't know if she's even willing to serve, let alone a real candidate. But she's the kind of person, again, that I think we need.
As the president said, we'll probably know sometime this month. Frank, always great to have your insights. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Frank Gaffney is president of the Center for Security Policy. He also served as an assistant secretary of defense in the Reagan administration. When we come back, our weekly legal roundup, including the fallout from the Kavanaugh confirmation, with legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza from LibertyNation.com. Stay with us.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner. This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Just talking loud, just saying nothing.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Corombos, news director at Radio America and co-host of the 3 Martini Lunch podcast, filling in for Tim again this week. Tim will be back next week. Joining me as usual, Scott Cosenza, legal affairs editor at LibertyNation.com, with a full list of juicy legal topics for us this week. And Scott, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Greg.
Well, let's start with where we left off last week, and that's with the Brett Kavanaugh nomination. It was last weekend that the Senate voted 50-48 to advance the nomination to confirm it. He's now Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And in the wake of this, because we knew what the vote would be pretty much for about 24 hours before the final vote, the reaction from Kavanaugh opponents has been interesting, and we're going to look at this in a couple of different ways. One of the things you don't usually expect is for people to attack the system, they attack the Constitution that's put us in this position for how these things get resolved. For example, the Senate has the advise and consent role when confirming judicial nominees, but on the left, they're pointing out that, well, the Republicans have seats in states that's only 44% of the population. That shouldn't be that way. Why do we have the Senate the way it is when tiny states have the same say as big states like California and New York? And then you also have going all the way back to why President Trump even gets to make this appointment, this nomination. He won the Electoral College, but he didn't win the popular vote. Why do we even have these things? So what do you make of this going back to the arguments behind our founding document?
Well, I like to poke a little Tim in the side a little bit sometimes, and I'll do the same for you, Greg. You started off the segment by saying that you were confident in knowing what the vote would be 24 hours prior. I think you're the only person who was, okay, as I read the postmortems on this. Seems like most people did it. So, but in any case, I think that the recent attacks on the Senate as an institution are so hilarious because they're so transparent. I think most famously it was one of the high Google guys who said abolish the Senate. This is a great solution. And the reason why it's just so transparent is there are 700,000 people who live in Washington, D.C., and if you ask the average leftist if D.C. should have statehood, they'll tell you, yes, absolutely they should have statehood. So then the 700,000 people of D.C. would have the same number of votes in the U.S. Senate as the 28 million people in Texas, right? They don't have a problem with that because Texans send Republicans to the Senate by and large, and D.C., the presumption is, would send Democrats to the Senate by and large. So this idea that it's about fairness, I think, is wrong. It's also wrong that it seems like a lot of our students are being taught that fairness is an important part of the sort of rubric in our constitutional system, when, in fact, it was deliberately unfair. The notion that rural votes and urban votes might be treated differently, and that a state, like Delaware is also akin to California, and it's equalness for a state. Those are unequal measures. So we don't have a direct democracy. We have a constitutional republic which protects the rights of the minority, and that's why it was designed that way, to protect those rights. So we start taking down these fundamental pillars of our system. I think, you mentioned, was it 240 now years the Senate has been doing its job? It gets pretty scary.
Yeah, 1787 we put this together. Well, we didn't, but some really smart people did, and it seems to have worked fairly well.
We bear their... I think it's appropriate to say we, right? I mean, America is the one place in the world where we are, whether we have bloodlines or not. That's our direct legacy of freedom, I think. So I like that term.
Absolutely. So real quick follow-up. We're still hearing Democrats talk about if they take back the House next month in the midterm elections. Come January, we're going to get a fuller investigation into Brett Kavanaugh. There's also some talk. I mean, it's from Michael Avenatti, so even most of the Democrats aren't necessarily drinking this yet. But he's talking about court packing, bumping it up to 11 justices. So the 5 right-leaning justices now don't make up a majority if that goes through. What do you make of those tactics?
Yeah, the Avenatti thing is really, if he gets more popularity, I think the Democrats seem to be of a mind like where, well, if he can bring the votes and the money, then we're going to include him in our club. And if not, then no. And it was a real stinker of an accusation of his with the Kavanaugh hearings. And he's got a lot of sort of digging to do or filling in that hole, I should say. So we'll see about that. As far as impeachment goes, one of the things that for people don't realize, if Democrats win the majority, then they get the subpoena power. So they have the ability to direct legal subpoenas and compel testimony, and that's why it'll cause a mess. And some have said they will vote for or try to move for Kavanaugh's impeachment. I think that'll tear the country apart, and for that reason, whether or not he perjured himself or not, I just hope they don't do it, just because I think it will really lead to just a massive amount of discord in the country on a level that we haven't seen in a lot of years.
Talking with Scott Cosenza, legal affairs editor at LibertyNation.com. And one of the ways that the Democrats could make life difficult for President Trump and others, as you just mentioned, is through winning back the majority in the House or the Senate or both, most likely the House if they're going to win anywhere. But also one place where they're making a big play, especially with some pretty strident liberal activists, is in races for state attorneys general. And we're going to be seeing a lot of those races around the country. And you're following a story where a New York University School of Law program funded by billionaire Michael Bloomberg, who this week became a Democrat officially and is probably thinking about running for president, is placing lawyers in the offices of Democratic state attorneys general and paying them to prosecute energy companies and challenge Trump administration policies on energy and the environment. So obviously they're going to win in some states, some of them fairly prominent states. So it sounds like the courts are going to be pretty clogged here in the next 2 years at least.
We have seen a disturbing trend, Greg, of state attorneys generals using their office to promote a political ideology. It's a political position, so we can't divorce it entirely from politics so that the people's preferences with respect to their law enforcement priorities are honored. But this bald political, basically this climate change lawsuit stuff that we saw, again, Bloomberg funded with a little touch of what's his name from New York, everybody's favorite bugaboo, Soros, excuse me. And this privately funding public attorneys general, though, I think is very dangerous. We know that Mr. Bloomberg has some very anti-liberty positions, but even if we agreed with those positions, it's not appropriate for private actors to fund prosecutors, even if there's no direct influence, because we know there will be indirect influence, and that's an inappropriate influence on somebody that has the power to bring prosecutions in the name of the state.
Just a couple minutes left in our conversation here, so let's move now to Massachusetts. That's where a conservative nonprofit that plans to attack Massachusetts taxes in a pre-election ad brought a federal complaint Wednesday to keep its donors secret. Represented by Foley Hogue and the Institute for Free Speech, the Massachusetts Fiscal Alliance would fall under the state's reporting scheme merely because it plans to mention a state senator in an ad. So the fight over here is, I guess, who you can mention and what that constitutes in terms of the law. And once again, it looks like knowing who the donors are is a big priority of the left. It kind of reminds us of the IRS scandal.
You know, you wonder, why is it so important for them to know who donors are when we know that politicians have said they want to reward their backers and punish their opponents using law and regulation? And that's why it's important for these people to conceal their identity. They don't want government actors punishing them for exercising their free speech. And that's all we're talking about here. They're saying to their fellow Massachusettsans, hey, it's not okay to levy an additional tax on people simply because they're wealthy. They pay more money anyway, right? They're making more, so they're paying more. But they shouldn't have a separate and additional burden over and above everybody else's burden simply because they're very successful. And they should be able to, the pro-freedom position is they should be able to say that sentence without having to identify themselves, because they're fearful of the Massachusetts taxing authorities, right, and the governance of laying the hammer down on them. So it's a pro-freedom position, and to the extent possible, we should allow more speech as always the cure for bad speech.
Lastly, Scott, I'm sure the response you'd get is the word transparency would be in there, and the phrase dark money would be in there from your critics on this one. What would you say that it's all about the sunshine policy? We just want to know who's involved. What's the big deal?
Well, how do you protect them against a tyrant? So, for instance, many people on the left and many libertarians, for that matter, thought that Sheriff Joe Arpaio was a horrible censor, and he actually punished his critics. So people who wanted to run against him were really deterred from doing so because of the way he ran his office. So from the left, you can see how there could be a strong man on the right who would, inappropriately punish his critics if he had their identity. So by protecting one's identity, we can protect against that. I think it's a real pro-freedom position. I think there are some arguments that you can make, and you just made. It's not a case of no downside, but to me, the equation clearly rests on anonymous speech encourages more freedom and therefore should be allowed, just in like the tradition that we have with Cato's letters and Publius. Federalist Papers, our tradition, the Western tradition, is to allow the most speech possible, and we all benefit from it.
Scott, we never have enough time for this segment, but tremendous analysis on all three of these topics. There's more we certainly could have gotten to. Thanks very much for your time this week.
Thank you, Greg.
Scott Cosenza is legal affairs editor at LibertyNation.com, and that will do it for this edition of Liberty Nation on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Corombos, news director at Radio America and co-host of the Three Martini Lunch podcast, sitting in for Tim Donner, who will be right back here next week. And until then, stand up for liberty.